Today we're talking about meta in Smite. In Smite's context, or any MOBA's context, meta defines which characters are typically played where, which characters are strong and whatnot, and we're going to focus on the part of which characters are played where, in Conquest specifically. So one thing is very obvious in terms of Smite's meta, and that is that you have two players in duo lane early on, you have one player in middle lane, you have one player in solo lane, and you have a jungler. Keep in mind that this doesn't necessarily have to be like that. It's established as the most efficient way, but theoretically it would be possible to have two guards in solo lane, so short lane would become a second duo lane, or two guards in the jungle as well. As of now, the most efficient way that works best in most scenarios is considered what we have at this point, being the double duo lane and the single jungler. Whenever there are big changes to the game, you can expect people to try and break the meta in various sorts. There will be attempts to make, for example, double jungle work, but at the moment, as it stands, that's not the case. What is more often attempted is bringing different characters into different lanes. This is done throughout the whole season, not even necessarily only when there are changes, but at any point of the season you can see people trying to bring characters into unexpected roles, either just to try it out or to throw their opponent off and specifically counter a character they are playing. Let's first look at the standard meta in Conquest. Typically, you will have a hunter and a guardian in the duo lane, a mage in the middle lane, a warrior in the solo lane, and an assassin in the jungle. This is mostly because these are considered the best positions for the specific roles, and you kind of want to have one of each in many team comps. Not every team comp, but many, simply because the roles complement each other pretty well. It is relatively easy to stray from this base meta while still playing meta. For example, Ao Kuang can be played in the jungle and is still a mage, even though he's rather an assassin mage. You can play warriors, for example, Guan Yu in support. You can play guardians, for example, Xing Tian in solo. You can play hunters, for example, Ullr in middle lane. And you can play mages, for example, Sol as the ADC in duo lane. So in that regard, the meta is not as set into stone as you may think when first looking at the first tutorials of Smite. However, there are limitations to this. For example, imagine a team where you have a Sol in the duo lane, you have a Kronos in the middle lane, you have a Xing Tian in the solo lane, you have an Ao Kuang in the jungle, and you have a Sobek on support. Individually, all of these characters are suited for the specific positions they're played in. In combination, it's a pretty terrible choice because you only have magical damage. In the same sense, you could go a hunter in middle lane, you could go a normal assassin in the jungle, you could go a hunter in duo lane, you could go a warrior support, and you could go a warrior in solo, and all of a sudden you would only have physical damage, which could all still be viable characters for their specific places, but the combination would make it horrible. This is why, even though those niche picks exist, they always need to be communicated. I wouldn't necessarily call them niche picks even, but those outside of the default role picks. If I want to play Ao Kuang in the jungle, that's absolutely fine, and he's probably one of the best junglers we have at the moment. But I need to let my team know, in order to make sure that we're not getting another magical character on solo lane, and end up with a very high amount of magical damage and hardly any physical damage, unless that is my goal from the start and we want to focus on getting that one physical character fed, which can also work in a coordinated team, but it's typically worse when you're playing with randoms. Now let's look at why the roles are where they are. Guardians generally have relatively strong base damage, so they have a decent amount of damage early, and they usually bring some kind of zoning or crowd control to the team. Hunters, on the other hand, have relatively weak early games, especially now that Golden Bow is gone again, and ramp up throughout the course of the game. So they kind of need some assistance in early stages of the game, most of the time, with some exceptions like Anhur or Neith. Therefore, those two go in a lane together, so the Guardian can protect the Hunter until the Hunter is strong enough to farm on his own. Mages typically have strong early games. They get relatively quick clear and are therefore very suited for a lane that needs to be cleared quickly and rotate a lot. Middle lane is one of the centers of early aggression, So having a god that clears well and can fight well there is very good. As such, mages are the best suitors for mid lane most of the time. In solo lane, you often want someone who is potent late game. Solo lane allows you to farm, and you can basically snowball out of the lane afterwards, or you can build up enough farm in the lane to be strong without even snowballing. In earlier times, we used to see a lot of, for example, Bakasura in the solo lane, simply because he was extremely potent at snowballing, getting a kill in lane, and then, rotating out before anyone else could and getting a lot of kills and end the game early. However, that's hardly the case these days. Solo lane has shifted a little bit and is now mostly reserved for tanks. This is for one very reason. Tanks have the potential to clear on their own right now. They have enough potential to contest the mid elementals, and they also bring a lot more to the table if the game doesn't go in your favor. They can opt to go for a second frontline or a bit more damage, mostly something in between, whereas with other characters you don't have the capability of putting a frontline there. The problem with the frontline issue is that you can't really put it anywhere else. Frontline characters just work best in solo. You can, for example, put a frontline character in the jungle as well, but he will typically not have enough clear there. In solo lane, the clear is sufficient by most warriors, so they can hold that lane and get that farm safely, and then frontline. In the jungle, the character would have to build more damage in order to be effective, taking away from the frontline potential. This is why certain solo picks that are often favored in lower ranks are kind of problematic. For example, Loki. Loki can only split push in late game, and his teamfight potential is more about making picks than actually assisting the team as a frontline. Loki simply can't frontline. Same goes, for example, for mages in solo lane like Kronos. People often pick those thinking that they can carry from there, but if they don't get that early snowball and the team's behind, the team will lack frontline in late game, which becomes very, very problematic. So realistically, most of the time, the only roles you really want to see in solo are warriors or specific guardians that have enough clear to make it work. For example, Ymir, Xingtian, until very recently Kebraken or Sobek. Then there's the jungle role. Assassins are, with some exceptions, the best fits for the jungle. They have the potential to clear 3 minions relatively quick, but often don't have a line ability to clear a whole lane. So the jungle is really where they shine. At the same time, most of them have some decent CC, crowd control, in their kit, so they can gank effectively, and they have the high damage to supplement that high burst immediate damage that goes onto the enemy character right away. So combine the strong clear in the jungle with the crowd control potential and the strong burst against single characters, making the assassins the best role for the jungle most of the time. Certain assassins also have the potential to serve as a third frontline, for example Thor, and build into some defense late game, allowing them to soak up some damage, which, for example, hunters and mages simply can't do as well. This doesn't apply to all assassins. Now we have established the meta and why it exists. So what about breaking the meta? When should I, for example, pick Guan Yu as a support? First of all, counter picks are always important. If you feel like the enemy team will not be able to handle a Guan Yu support very well, because they, for example, lack escapes or tools to shut down the healing, then Guan Yu support can be nice. But at the same time, you need to make sure to get some more magical damage elsewhere, for example, get a Guardian in solo lane. Also, Guardians, for example, work very well against certain warriors in solo lane, specifically those that have a lot of early aggression. Guardians will not outclear warriors in the solo lane, but they often build into Mark of the Vanguard, and it typically works better for them, and can therefore soak up huge amounts of damage from the warriors. Some matchups here, for example, are Xingtian versus Erlang Shen, where Xingtian simply sustains through all the damage Erlang Shen does. No one really wins the lane, but Erlang Shen wants to snowball a lane in order to be as effective as possible, and that's not going to happen with the Xingtian, who has high sustain, high defense, damage reduction, and good escape tools. Another example would be Ymir versus Sun Wukong. Ymir, with the damage mitigation in his kit, plus Mark of the Vanguard, does not take a lot of damage from Sun Wukong, who needs Bluestone Pendant early in order to clear effectively. with the bluestone ticks being reduced to hardly any of the original damage, there's not much Ymir needs to care about for most of the game. Ymir's damage early on is high because his base damage is high, and he will have an impact late game either way. Sun Wukong then has to try and keep up somehow, but is not half the lane bully that he's supposed to be in another matchup. In the mid lane, the counter picks are more limited. What you will see is certain hunters being picked against mages that are also more late game focused. For example, if your enemy goes for Kronos, then it makes sense to go for an Ullr, who is also relatively based on the late game and can clear strong enough early, so you both have that late game potential, and you probably have some more bully potential on Ullr late game as he has more ability damage. In duo, certain mages just make sense for the carry role. Sol is an example, Kronos is another, especially Freya is very, very potent at the moment. There is no harm in picking those, as long as you can be sure to get your physical damage somewhere else. Freya even outclears certain hunters by quite a significant margin and has some very strong synergy with, for example, Fafnir, so this can work in your favor. Coming back to the Guan Yu pick, there's also certain things you have to keep in mind about composition when it comes to support and the late game. If you see a Fafnir on the enemy team, you can be sure that the enemy team will have a lot of late game potential. Fafnir simply comes with a very strong steroid, which allows him to be very good in late game. Guan Yu kind of counters this. While his abilities are partially interrupted by Fafnir, it's not necessarily the best matchup early in every regard. He will have a lot of late game potential for his team as well, simply because of the heal. So, while the team with Fafnir will be very strong, the team with Guan Yu as a support will also be very strong late game, as long as there's some other frontline somewhere else. So, if you're considering to pick something that's outside of the meta or a niche pick in the meta, just consider why you're doing it. If you're in a Conquest game and it's just casual and you're just doing it for fun, sure, go ahead. But if you're trying to win the game and you're focusing on that and you're trying to counterpick in a ranked scenario especially, then ask yourself, why am I picking this? Does this make sense? Is this something that works synergistic with the team? Does it force anyone else into another pick, and do I have to let him know? Is that other person comfortable on that pick? Certain people just play Warriors in solo lane and don't like playing Guardians in solo, and it's going to be hard for them to adjust just because you wanted to pick something else. At the same time, if you have absolutely no faith in your team doing anything right, there's no harm in picking a split push guard. While I personally wouldn't advocate picking Loki ever, he can still be very good in that scenario. The same sense, Bastet as a jungler can be very good because they can simply split push on their own without having to care about the team fight and so on. So while I'm somebody who is absolutely for breaking the meta and trying to make things outside of the ordinary work, always ask yourself, is there a reason to do it? And if I'm not just doing it for fun, how do I make it work effectively? And communicate what you're planning on doing with your team. If you're unranked and you're locking a solo lane mage in 4th or 5th position without letting your team know beforehand, you're probably an asshole. With those words, thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I make new videos every day, so feel free to check back tomorrow. Also, letting you know that I will be streaming today, so feel free to stop by. Thanks for watching. Duke Sloth, out.